back in his prime, YSG used to be one of, if not the strongest commanders in the whole of Rise of Kingdoms, and with the release of so many new archer commanders over the years, like Zulang, Hermann Prime, Boudica, and even Henry and Ashurbanipal, Pal, is YSG still really that extremely powerful and strong investment? I've spoken about this before, but so many more commanders have come out since then. So in today's video, I'm going to answer that question. Is YSG still a good commander in 2024? Now let's just start off by going over what actually made YSG a good commander to begin with, and do these things still hold up? And the first thing I think that made YSG very strong was that at his time of release, he easily had the best damage factor in the game, especially once you expertised him. And the other thing that added to this was the fact he had a 5-target AoE. At the time of his release, he was, I think, the only commander besides Ethelfled who had a 5-target AoE that actually dealt damage, because Ethelfled has one and YSG also has one. And both of those things aren't really the case nowadays. He obviously still has his 5-target AoE, but he definitely doesn't have the best DPS in the game. There are a lot of commanders which just out-damage him. For example, in just the archer category alone, I'd say Zulang and also possibly Hermann Prime when he's ramped up just do more damage than YSG, and a few other commanders probably who are a bit stronger. You've got Lao Che with definitely more damage, you've got Scipio who's arguably got more damage in my opinion, and then you've also got commanders such as Joan Prime who have just got ridiculous amounts of AoE as well, who just really out-damage YSG in pretty much every regard, and even Scipio who doesn't really have many damage boosts because of how tanky he is and how long he can last. He does in some ways end up pretty much out-damaging a YSG. So the first thing that made him really strong, his crazy, just league above every other commander in terms of damage, is no longer a selling point for YSG. Not to say his damage factor is bad nowadays, it's certainly still fairly powerful, especially with his 50% skill damage bonus, but there are a lot of other commanders who do what he does in terms of the damage at a higher level and also have other bonuses such as debuffs and such as defensive stats, which make them stronger on the open field. The second thing that made YSG an extremely powerful commander was the fact that he was extremely generic. When we looked at YSG's kit at the time, his active skill was just generic direct damage. His second skill, you get rage gain, doesn't matter which troops you're running, and you do get archer attack. It's a lot of attack, but once again, not really necessary for his kit. The skill damage was generic, and his third skill is a garrison skill. And what does that really mean? Well, he could work with any commander. At his time of release, YSG was pretty much used with every march. If you had an infantry march, you'd run like a YSG with an Alexander the Great, YSG with Martel, YSG with Richard. If you had Cavs, you could actually run YSG with Minamoto. It actually wasn't even too far-fetched at the time. And this is somewhat the case nowadays. I do sometimes still see YSG with an infantry march, like maybe Scipio for someone who's just reached Season of Conquest, but he's definitely not that generic powerhouse like he used to be. This is because you can't really justify running an archer commander nowadays with other troop types, especially since 100% attack, even though back then it wasn't the biggest thing in his kit, nowadays it does make a fairly big difference. And something we should consider as well is YSG's Museum Relic, which is only archer defense, and these stats are beginning to add up more and more, and with a lot of commanders being more and more specialized, YSG, especially towards the endgame, isn't that generic commander who you can just chuck with any commander and it's going to work. He's no longer so powerful that it will just work like that. He needs to be with another archer commander that synergizes well with him, and really he can't go with other troop types past the really early game. So he's already lost two of his biggest selling points, which were really his high damage and his extremely generic commander usage, as he just worked with anyone. Another thing he did hold at the time as well though was the fact that he had a lot of early game potential. He could be used to chain barbarians just inside of KVK and also be used in KVK itself, and was probably one of the strongest commanders for that. And realistically, I'd say that's definitely still the case. When we look back at KVK 1 and 2 nowadays, if you do have an expertise YSG, you're probably up there with some of the stronger players who are fighting, because YSG still makes like a really big difference inside of KVK 2 and KVK 1. KVK 3, not so much, but KVK 2 and 1, he's definitely one of the more powerful commanders that you will see on the open field there. And even with his AoE barb farming and stuff in Season of Conquest still now, that does translate. You can certainly AoE Barb with YSG in Season of Conquest in Season 1, Season 2. He's still certainly a good commander for that, so I'd say he's still got his early game uses, but something that has affected him in that regard is the fact that before there were 3 KVKs you'd have to go through. You do Preparation Season, Season 1, 2, and 3, with YSG probably being one of the best commanders for those 4 seasons. But realistically, nowadays YSG is only used in Season 1 and 2. I didn't mean to say Preparation Season, that you can't use him there, but Season 1 and 2 are where you get YSG, and you can't really use him in Season 3. I mean, you can, but he's not the strongest option. You're better off getting other commanders. So he gets 2 seasons where he's the strongest commander, or one of the strongest commanders, and that's certainly given him a bit of a hit to his early game value, especially for investments, since he isn't the strongest commander anymore in Season 3 and Season of Conquest like he used to be, and there are just better options who will always outshine him, especially once you hit Season 3 and you're moving towards Season of Conquest. But as an AoE barb farming commander, he's still certainly up there with some of the best, and he's going to give you a lot of early game value if that's something you do very, very often. But if you're not AoE barb farming 24/7, YSG is probably not your best option to invest in just for early game AoE barb farming, since he isn't the most powerful on the open field there. The final thing, which I did touch on a little bit, that made YSG a really good commander as well, was his late game potential with other commanders like Alexander the Great, and this goes back to him being a generic commander with really generic damage, and him also being a really good early game commander, and realistically, it's also not the case nowadays. YSG is still a decent late game commander with decent late game potential, and I'll touch on that later, but nowadays, he isn't the most powerful. There are other options, like I've said. If you just saved your gold heads, Zulang is just a better commander, and so is Hermann Prime if you're looking for an archer commander, and Alexander the Great with YSG just isn't a thing anymore. If you ran that on the open field, it's like asking to feed your opponent kills, and it's not really going to work out. So he doesn't have that early to late game transition like he used to, where YSG was still used in pretty much every single match at that time. So he doesn't hold anymore that dominant early game position that translates into a very powerful and definitely a strong late game position as well. So YSG has lost a lot of his touch. We can see here, he's no longer the best DPS commander in the game. He's not really a generic commander. He only works with archer commanders realistically nowadays. He's not really the best choice for the early game besides AoE barb farming, and his late game potential with other commanders, especially Alexander the Great, who used to be the other most commonly used commander, is certainly just not there anymore. And these 4 things, which he used to be really good at and made him really strong, just are not really applicable anymore, and that's definitely given him a big hit to his kit. The next thing I would like to talk about with YSG though is what is still good about his kit nowadays and how did he perform for me. And I think the first thing I really like about his kit is just the ridiculous amount of skill damage you have 24/7. It's a very, very high amount of skill damage. Most commanders can't reach this even nowadays. You see a few commanders like maybe Nevsky and also Hermann Prime when he's ramped up. But realistically, YSG still holds some of the highest skill damage increases in the game, and he still does have some of the highest damage factor. He's probably like, in my opinion, 4th or 5th in the whole entire game for just damage factor in general. And another thing he really does well is he's a very good rage engine. I've noticed throughout my KVK, and this touches on the performance part, he is really, really, really strong in terms of rage engine and super convenient to use. Sometimes my YSG will just straight up get a better trade than Zulang because he can throw his active skill off before I have to run away. His rage gain can be insane. Pair it with the skill tree, sometimes it goes crazy. The skill tree is run on my Boudica, not really my YSG, since she's the primary in the March, and they're just able to just gain like a ton of rage and deal a ton of skill damage really quickly. So he definitely still holds a lot of skill damage potential. Just because he's not the best in the game anymore doesn't mean his skill damage is bad. And like I said, the convenience and ease of use for his rage gain is amazing, with just the crazy amount of skill damage bonuses definitely do help him become one of the strongest DPS commanders in the game. And the only thing he's lacking though is that small amount of damage factor, which he is missing. One thing to know with YSG though is that he is definitely not the tankiest commander. I've noticed throughout using him in my KVK, if my Boudica YSG did get hit, it often lost a lot of troops really quickly. Not to say it would usually get a bad trade, its AoE was usually able to make up for that, but it wouldn't be very sustainable on the open field, and after maybe 5 or 6 fights with him, it'd pretty much be a gone march. It'd be like down to the red or the really low yellow HP, like 80,000 units remaining, and you have to refresh it. Whereas commanders like Zulang, even though they are not necessarily tanky, they have stats like health in their kit, which definitely do help them in fighting situations just being more sustained. And obviously, you can't say that it's the Boudica's fault. She's actually a fairly tanky commander. It's definitely more of YSG in this case, who's got pretty much no tanky stats in his kit. Though I definitely think there are commanders which can help him with that. He synergizes well with Hermann, he synergizes well with Henry, Boudica, and also some ways Zulang and Nebuchadnezzar. But like I said, he's still going to be a squishy commander in most of those marches and isn't really bringing many tanky stats to them. The only thing that he is doing pretty well is his Museum Relic does give him that small amount of defense. It's actually a fairly sizable amount, which can give him a bit more potential, but still, Zulang, as an example, is giving you 30% health, and for archers, health is a really amazing stat, and it's just overall more valuable. So YSG, even though he does get the defense, is still a really squishy commander, who you'll notice will struggle a lot on the open field, especially if you do get hit. But other than that, his damage factor is definitely still up to par nowadays. His trades, in my opinion, with my Boudica were perfectly fine, and I'm no whale for Crystal Tech. I only bought the 50% Crystal Mine Speed and the daily login for it. So YSG in KVKs still certainly is a fairly decent performing commander, but only if you put him with another archer commander, and also they have to have decent gear. I mean, to be fair, I'm a full archer main, my account is made to specialize around them, so he should be performing pretty well, and if your account isn't as specialized as mine into archers, I'd still say he'd be a very solid commander. Keep in mind though, he also will lag behind your murder ball. This is something I don't personally experience. I don't run any infantry or cav marches, but if you did, and most players do, and I recommend doing so, YSG is usually going to be slower than most of the fast infantry commanders like Scipio and even Lao Che, and he's certainly going to be slower than most of the cav commanders such as Nevsky and Jones. So YSG is just going to be slow in that regard, but that's kind of an issue for all archers, though he does really make it even worse with the fact he's got no march speed in his kit pretty much at all. So he performs well on the open field. If you're able to use him and actually get his active skills off and fight with him, he'll definitely get fairly decent trades. But if he's too slow and he's getting targeted a lot, you're going to notice he's not going to trade nearly as good. Now, the next thing I'd like to discuss, and this will be the final thing before I tell you my final opinion on YSG, is has he actually become stronger since Hermann Prime was released? Since a lot of people have said YSG is only getting weaker and weaker as new commanders release, I think Hermann Prime was kind of a shift in a different direction. And the reason I say this is because Hermann Prime's synergy with YSG is extremely, extremely good. Hermann Prime is just straight up increasing AoE skill damage, not to mention he's dealing poison AoE stacks, which can once again make YSG stronger. And because of those two things, which while they may not sound like a major thing, it can increase his skill damage by something like 200% if you're attacking all 3 targets. So YSG with a Hermann Prime and even just the murder ball is amazing for him. It makes him a much stronger commander while also just making your murder ball stronger as well. And I'd say that Hermann Prime was in almost a way an indirect buff to YSG. It's actually made YSG a more valuable commander who is just stronger overall. And if you don't have a Zulang for whatever reason and you have a Hermann Prime, or maybe you had a Boudica and then you got Hermann, if you got YSG to go with that Hermann, it's going to be a really solid march, while maybe you work on Zulang, or maybe you're running a Boudica with an Artemisia. So Hermann with YSG is an amazing march still nowadays, and I think it's actually given YSG a little bit more valuable in the current meta, especially with his amazing AoE stats as well. Then Hermann is able to pretty much amplify and make even stronger, which is obviously going to improve your trades by quite a bit. So unlike Zulang and other archer commanders that have come into the game who are just stronger with different commanders, I'd say that Hermann Prime was actually in a way a buff to YSG and makes him quite a bit more valuable and stronger on the open field. So now that we've really discussed pretty much everything to do with YSG, what made him good, how does he perform for me, and a little bit about what makes him strong, and also what I think of him with the release of Hermann, what is my final and full opinion on him? Well, the realistic opinion I can give is he's probably the 6th strongest archer commander in the game. The order for the commanders will probably be like Zulang, Hermann, Boudica, Henry, a Shirbanipal, and then YSG. Or you could put a Shirbanipal above Boudica or below, depending where you really like him. And YSG would just always be in rank 6, no matter what. All those 5 commanders I mentioned are realistically just going to be stronger and better than YSG, because YSG is just an older commander. He's definitely a few leagues behind all the new commanders, but that being said, I'd also say his early game potential is nowhere near as good as it used to be. When I discussed him almost a year ago now, he was pretty much still fairly good for Season 1, 2, and 3 because Season 3 didn't have all the Season of Conquest commanders, but nowadays it has all those new commanders, and YSG has a lot less time to really shine. So overall with YSG, he's still a strong commander. I always say this with commanders, they're always going to have some open field usage. Even if you go to someone like Ramses, he's probably going to trade fairly negative, but he's not going to be the worst thing in the game. They're still going to be okay, and with YSG, I'd say this is still the case. He's slightly above okay, but he's definitely not at that meta level. And as an early game investment, he's solid, but once again, he's not at the meta level, which is just saving all your gold heads. So my final opinion on YSG is he's still a good commander, but I wouldn't really invest in him unless you're running 3 Archer Marches. And even then, with Boudica Prime and Artemisia synergy, you probably end up running them instead of a YSG, which in that situation, YSG falls down to the 7th best Archer commander. So realistically, for YSG, it's probably only downhill from here as new Cav commanders come out and more Archer commanders come out. We will see him fall out of the meta quite soon, and he is probably, sadly, the next person in my murder board to be replaced after I replace Cyrus with a Shirobani Pile. So YSG is probably next to go for my murder board, but he still has a good solid year or so of value left for me. But if you're not running a pure Archer murder board like me, which has 3 of the best Archer Marches I can try to make, you can probably hold on to YSG for another 2 to 3 years, and he's still going to get okay trades, since his AoE is always going to be pretty banger in Rise of Kingdoms. So overall, YSG still is a decent commander, but he's nowhere near the number 1 investment, and in the early game, there are just better options to use or save your gold heads for this Season of Conquest commanders. So now that we've made it to the end of today's video, I just want to ask you guys for a very small favor, and that is consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. It's going to benefit both you and me, because if you're watching today's video, I'm guessing you have a YSG or you're interested in YSG, and I upload videos about every single commander in the game at some point. I think every single commander ever, I've discussed something about them, and I discuss current affairs in the game, I discuss updates, I discuss ways to get more value for your account. So if you want to subscribe to the channel to get more value in your Rise of Kingdoms account, to learn more about commanders and equipment, trust me, it's going to be worth your time. It's just a small thing, it helps me out a lot, and it hopefully will help you out too. Now, I just want to say thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.